My hand was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone into the sink. I stood in the bridal suite bathroom, veil pinned, dress zipped, 3 minutes before my father was supposed to walk me down the aisle. I pressed the phone harder against my ear like distance was the problem. Like if I just pushed it close enough her voice would change into something I recognized. It didn't. There was ice clinking in a glass on the other end. Waves somewhere behind her. And then she laughed. Not nervous, not sorry, just light like I'd asked her to pass the salt. Honey, don't be dramatic. A trip sounded more fun. I stared at myself in the mirror, mascara already threatening to run, and I heard myself ask the only question that mattered. Mom, what did you do? She didn't answer that. She hung up. My name is Naomi Bishop. I was 31 years old, and by the time that phone call happened, I had already built something most people spend a lifetime chasing and never catch. I owned at that point a boutique event design firm called Bishop & Field, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. I started it at 24 with $6,200 in savings and a laptop that overheated if you ran 2 tabs at once. By 31, I had 11 employees, a client roster that included 2 Fortune 500 holiday galas, and just under $2.1 million in annual revenue. I paid myself last every single month for the first 3 years. I know what it costs to build something from nothing because I bled for every dollar of it. I was marrying a man named Theo Alvarez, a structural engineer with a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants, and we had planned a wedding for 140 guests at a restored textile mill outside Asheville. Total cost, $84,000. My father, Richard Bishop, had put in $30,000. Theo's parents had covered another $20,000. I'd paid the remaining $34,000 myself, in full 6 weeks before the date. My mother, Carol Bishop, had contributed exactly one thing to the wedding. Her presence. Or she was supposed to. She wasn't just my mother. She was supposed to give the toast that afternoon. The one she'd insisted on writing herself. The one she'd told me 3 separate times she'd been working on for months. She was supposed to walk in with my father, sit in the front row, and watch her only daughter get married. Instead, she was on a beach in Turks and Caicos with her boyfriend of 4 months, a man named Gary Prentice, whom I had met exactly twice. I didn't know that yet, standing in that bathroom. All I knew was that my mother wasn't answering where she was. And in about 90 seconds I was going to have to walk out that door and tell my father, and 140 guests, that the woman who raised me had chosen a trip over my wedding. Here's what I pieced together. Standing in that bathroom in a $4,200 dress with my bouquet already wilting slightly in the heat, my mother had never planned to come. Not changed her mind that morning. Not something came up. She had booked the trip with Gary 6 weeks earlier, the exact week I'd wired the final payment to the venue. My cousin Priya found me first. She didn't say anything. She just held the bathroom door shut with her back so no one else could walk in. And she looked at me with the specific kind of pity that tells you the truth before anyone speaks it. She's not coming, is she? I said. Priya's silence was the answer. 20 minutes later, propped up on a folding chair just outside the reception tent because my legs had genuinely stopped being reliable, I opened Instagram out of some masochistic instinct I still don't fully understand. And there it was. A photo posted 11 minutes earlier. My mother in a white sundress, white at my wedding hour, standing ankle-deep in turquoise water, Gary's arms slung around her waist, a frozen drink with a little umbrella sweating in her free hand. The caption read, "Some days you just have to choose you waterwave son #self-care #new beginnings." 43 comments already. Someone had written, "You deserve this, Carol." Someone else, "Living your best life," smiling face with heart eyes. My father read it over my shoulder in the tent and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said quietly, "She told me she had a migraine and was staying home." That was the first lie. It would not be the last. I got married anyway. I want to say that clearly because the story people expect is that I fell apart on the spot. I didn't. Theo walked out to meet me at the aisle himself, because my father needed 10 minutes to compose his face. And Theo said the only thing that made sense that whole day, "We're not giving her the wedding to. We got married." I smiled in the photos. I gave a normal toast. And 2 days later, back home, sitting on my kitchen floor in sweatpants because the couch felt too far away, I finally listened to the voicemail my mother had left 40 minutes before the ceremony, the one I'd never gotten to in the chaos. Her voice was warm, rehearsed. "Hi, sweetie, it's Mom. I just wanted to say I know today's a big day and I'm sorry I can't be there, but honestly between us, Gary's been under so much stress with the divorce finalizing, and he really needed this trip, and I thought you'll understand when you're older, sometimes you have to take care of the person who's actually there for you day to day." Played it 4 times. Each time it got colder. 3 weeks later my father called me, and his voice had a flatness I'd never heard from him. He was helping my mother. Despite everything, they still shared one joint account left over from the divorce settlement, used only for a rental property they co-owned. Settle a tax document. And in doing so, he found a wire transfer. $18,000. Sent from that joint account to Gary Prentice 8 days before my wedding. I drove to my father's house that night. I sat at his kitchen table with the statement between us like evidence at a trial, because that's essentially what it was. "I confronted her," my dad said. "She told me it was a loan." Said Gary's business, some kind of boutique real estate consulting firm, had a cash flow gap because of a closing delay on a Sarasota property, and she was just bridging it until escrow released. Said it was completely standard in commercial real estate. Sounded plausible. It had the right vocabulary. I let it sit. I pretended to believe it. I even sent my mother a text 3 days later, polite, neutral, the kind of text you send when you're trying to look like you've moved on. "Hope the trip was relaxing. Let's talk soon." She responded with a heart emoji. Nothing else. But I didn't stop looking. I am, professionally, someone who plans events for a living, which means I am also someone who reads contracts, tracks vendors, and notices when numbers don't add up. So I did what I do for a living. I investigated quietly. I found out Gary Prentice's boutique real estate consulting firm, Prentice Coastal Advisory, had no state business registration in Florida. I found a small claims filing from an ex-business partner 2 years earlier accusing Gary of exactly what my father had just described, bridge loans that were never repaid. Then at a family barbecue I almost didn't attend, I overheard my mother and Gary through an open kitchen window while I was getting ice from the garage freezer. They didn't know I was there. Gary's voice low and pleased with himself. "She bought the escrow story?" My mother laughing, that same light, careless laugh from the phone call. "Richard did. Naomi's too busy with her little party business to notice anything. You should have seen her face at the wedding though. Priceless." I stood in that garage for a long time before I went back inside. 2 weeks after the barbecue I got access, through my father, who by now was as invested as I was, to the full transaction history on that joint account, since he was still a signatory. Another wire. $24,000 this time. Same recipient. Same vague memo line. Personal loan repayment TBD. $42,000. Not bridging escrow. Not a loan to anyone with a real business. When I finally ran a deeper search, the kind of digging that takes patience, not luck, I found the truth sitting quietly in a county court database. Gary Prentice had 2 prior judgments against him for unpaid debts, totaling almost $60,000, and an open bankruptcy filing from 4 years earlier that had never fully discharged because he'd failed to disclose assets. He wasn't bridging escrow. He was bleeding my mother dry, and she had chosen him. Chosen his fake business and his fake stress and his real charm, over walking her only daughter down the aisle. The last piece landed on a Tuesday. I was going through old joint statements with my father, mostly out of habit at that point, when I found a withdrawal from 8 months earlier, long before the wedding, long before Gary had fully moved in on her life. $9,000, pulled from an account my parents had quietly kept for years, labeled, in my mother's own handwriting on the paper statement, Naomi Wedding. She had been saving for my wedding, and she'd handed almost all of it to Gary before I'd even finalized my venue. I sat with that for a long time. Not the money stung, but I could survive the money. It was the order of operations. She had decided months before I said I do. That Gary mattered more than the day I dreamed about since I was a kid, drawing veils in the margins of my school notebooks. The trip wasn't a spontaneous betrayal. It was the final receipt for a decision she'd already made. I made a decision sitting in my car outside my father's house, engine off, hands on the wheel. I was not going to come at my mother and Gary with what I knew. Not yet. People who know they're caught get careful. People who think they've gotten away with something get sloppy, and worse, they get generous with their own arrogance. They talk. They celebrate. I needed them talking. So I performed. I called my mother 2 days later and let my voice crack. Genuinely didn't have to fake all of it, honestly, and told her I'd been having a hard time processing everything, and that I just wanted things to feel normal again. I asked, in a small voice I don't usually use, if she and Gary wanted to come to a family dinner I was hosting in 6 weeks, just to move forward. I slouched more when I saw her in person after that. I let my hands fidget. I stopped bringing up the wire transfers, stopped asking sharp questions, let my sentences trail off like I genuinely didn't have the energy to finish a thought. I wore my hair down and messy instead of the sleek ponytail I always wore to family things, small, but she noticed. She told Priya I seemed like I was finally letting it go. Internally, I was doing math the entire time. If Gary thought no one was watching his finances, he'd keep spending. If my mother thought I'd swallowed the escrow story, she'd keep protecting him instead of protecting herself. I needed one more thing. Proof, in their own words, in front of witnesses, that couldn't be explained away with jargon a second time. Theo asked me once quietly in bed if I was okay pretending like this. I told him the truth. I'm not pretending to forgive her. I'm pretending to be too weak to do anything about it. Those are different things. The dinner was the bait. I told my mother it was just family low-key at my place. A peace offering. What I didn't tell her was that I'd invited my father, Priya, Theo, and the detail that mattered, a family friend named Denise Okafor, who happened to be a licensed private investigator I'd hired 3 weeks earlier under a standard consulting contract, introduced to everyone simply as my friend from the design conference. I'd also, with my father's full knowledge and consent as co-owner of the account, set up email alerts on the joint account for any further transfers. And I'd asked my father, calmly, not dramatically, to bring the 2 wire transfer confirmations and the county judgment printouts against Gary, folded in an envelope, just in case. 2 nights before the dinner, my phone buzzed under my pillow at 11:40 p.m. An account alert. A 3rd wire request had been initiated, not yet completed, pending my father's 2nd signature approval, which he had not given, for $31,000. Gary's memo line this time. Expansion Capital, Q3. I lay there in the dark, phone glowing, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. The night of the dinner, I set my phone on the counter, face down, screen brightness low, recording app running, legal in North Carolina with one-party consent, which I'd confirmed with an actual attorney beforehand, because I needed this done right, not just done. Denise sat at the far end of the table with a notepad she made look like a sketchbook. My father kept the envelope in his jacket pocket. I watched my mother laugh at something Gary said, watched her top off his wine glass before her own, watched him lean back in his chair like a man who already considered this house partially his. I felt my phone's silence under the counter like a held breath. Everything was in place. All I had to do now was wait for them to be exactly who they'd already shown me they were. It didn't take long. Dinner was almost over. Plates cleared, coffee out. When Gary, 2 glasses of wine in, decided to be generous with his opinions. You know, Naomi, he said, gesturing loosely with his fork. For someone who runs a whole company, you sure took that wedding thing hard. It was one day. Your mom's allowed to live her life. My mother laughed. That laugh again. Gary's right, honey. You've always been a little sensitive about attention. Comes from being an only child, I think. Priya's fork froze halfway to her mouth. My father's jaw tightened. I set my coffee cup down. Quiet click on the saucer. I didn't raise my voice. I never did that whole night, not once. Mom, can I ask you something? The Naomi wedding fund. The $9,000 you 2 saved for 6 years. When did you decide to give it to Gary instead? The table went still. My mother's smile flickered but held. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Same way you know Prentice Coastal Advisory isn't a registered business in the state of Florida. I looked at Gary. Same way you know about the 2 judgments against you totaling almost $60,000, and the bankruptcy filing you never fully disclosed. Gary's face changed color in real time. That's private information, that's not. This is a misunderstanding, there's context. There's always context, I said. There's an escrow story. There's a Q3 expansion story. There's $42,000 already gone and a third wire for $31,000 sitting in pending approval right now, waiting on my father's signature. I turned to my mother. You spent my wedding fund on a man with 2 judgments against him and an undischarged bankruptcy, and then you flew to Turks and Caicos instead of watching me get married, so you could protect him from finding out you were broke. That is not, my mother started, voice rising for the first time. But I kept going, same even tone, laying out fact after fact like place settings. I have the wire confirmations. I have the county court records. I have the voicemail where you told me I'd understand when I'm older. And I have tonight on my phone, right there on the counter, recording since before we sat down, including the part 4 minutes ago where Gary called me sensitive for being upset that my mother chose him over my wedding, and where you agreed with him. Gary stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. You can't. That's illegal. You can't record people without. North Carolina's a one-party consent state, Denise said calmly from the end of the table, closing her notepad. I've been advising Naomi as a licensed investigator for the last 3 weeks. Everything discussed tonight has been properly documented, and copies of the financial records have already been forwarded to an attorney, along with a report to the County Consumer Fraud Division regarding Mr. Prentice's pattern of solicited loans from partners under false business pretenses. My father set the envelope on the table, unopened, and just looked at my mother. Carol, I trusted you with that account because I trusted you, not him. My mother reached for the envelope with a shaking hand. I picked up the wedding invitation still magnet to my fridge behind me, the one with her RSVP card tucked in the frame, the will attend box checked in her own handwriting months earlier, and I tore it once cleanly down the middle and set the 2 halves on the table in front of her. You checked the box, I said. You just never meant it. Gary was already at the door, fumbling with his coat, when my father's phone rang. He'd made one more call before dinner, to a colleague at the district attorney's consumer protection unit he'd worked with years earlier on a fraud case. 2 officers were waiting in an unmarked car outside, not for an arrest. The DIS office would need weeks to build that, but to formally serve Gary with notice of the fraud complaint and freeze order request on the joint account, effective that night at my father's request as co-owner. Gary didn't get to leave quietly. He got to leave with paperwork. What happened next unfolded over the following 10 weeks, and I tracked all of it the way I track vendor invoices, carefully, and without much emotion left to spare. Gary Prentice was formally investigated by the County Consumer Fraud Division. The freeze order held. 2 additional victims came forward within a month, a widow in Sarasota and a retired contractor in Wilmington, both of whom had loaned Gary money for the same fictional real estate consulting business. He was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and obtaining property by false pretenses. His case is still moving through the courts as of this recording, but the freeze order alone recovered $19,000 of my parents' $42,000 before it could be spent. My mother was not charged with anything. She was legally a willing participant in her own decisions, not a victim of fraud in the eyes of the law, though the DIS office noted she'd cooperated fully once the freeze order was in place. But the social fallout was its own sentence. Word moves fast in a family that size. Her sister stopped taking her calls. She was quietly uninvited from Thanksgiving at my aunt's house. No confrontation needed, just an invite that never came. My father finalized the full separation of their joint accounts within 3 weeks, something he'd put off for 2 years out of a strange, lingering loyalty. She moved out of the rental property they'd co-owned by the end of that month. My father, by contrast, I made sure to protect publicly and privately. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been deceived just as thoroughly as I had. And he'd been the one who handed over the evidence that made the whole thing possible. I gave him the frame-torn invitation, both halves reassembled behind glass, not as a trophy but as something he asked to keep. So I remember what trusting the wrong story costs, he told me. And there was one act of grace I want to include because it mattered to me more than any of the consequences. My mother's longtime assistant at the small nonprofit where she volunteered, a woman named Rosa, 61 years old, who had nothing to do with any of this and who'd always been kind to me at family events, reached out privately, mortified, asking if she should step back from working near my mother now that everyone knows. I told her no. I told her this wasn't her mess to inherit, and I helped her find a reference and a warm introduction to a friend's nonprofit board when funding dried up for her old position 6 months later, unrelated to any of this but timed badly. She didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't going to let her feel like she had. I didn't do any of this for an audience. But I won't pretend it didn't feel like justice, watching a house of cards collapse in the exact order it was built. It was late November, almost 5 months after the wedding, when my mother showed up at my door. It was raining, the cold kind that gets into your collar, and she stood on my porch in a coat I didn't recognize, thinner than I remembered, mascara doing the same thing mine had done in that bathroom mirror months earlier. Gary was gone, left the state, last she'd heard, once the fraud case gained traction and other creditors started circling. She'd lost the rental property in the settlement with my father. She told me, staying in a friend's guest room for now. I made mistakes, she said, and her voice shook in a way that wasn't performance, not this time. I know I did. I don't have anywhere else, Naomi. Can I come in? Just to talk. I stood in the doorway with the porch light throwing long shadows across her face, and I thought about the bathroom mirror, the ice clinking in her glass, the torn invitation still sitting framed on my father's mantel. You checked the box on my RSVP card, Mom. And then you spent my wedding fund on a man with 2 judgments against him. And you laughed about it in my own kitchen when you thought I couldn't hear you. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done pretending that not being angry means I owe you a door. Naomi, please. I hope you land somewhere safe, I said, and I meant it because I genuinely did. But it's not going to be here tonight. I closed the door. Gently. No slam, no dramatics, the kind of quiet click that means something has actually finally ended. Theo was in the kitchen when I turned around, 2 mugs of tea already made, like he'd known before I did what that knock would be. He didn't ask how it went. He just handed me the warmer mug and said, "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, and for the first time in 5 months I actually believed it. "I think I am." Here's what I learned standing in that bathroom in my wedding dress with a phone shaking in my hand. Some people will tell you exactly who they are, usually while laughing, and the kindest thing you can do for yourself is believe them the first time. Playing weak isn't the same as being weak. Sometimes patience is just power with better timing. And grace isn't something you owe the people who hurt you. It's something you choose to give the people who never did. So let me ask you, if you were standing in my shoes that day, phone in hand, ice clinking on the other end of the line, would you have kept the mic on? Or hung up right there? If this story hit home, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you would have done differently, and subscribe for more stories just like this one every week.